Hey everyone, so the Candidates tournament started, and I'm going to be reviewing decisive games played from this tournament. Honestly, this is one of the most exciting chess tournaments out there. I love watching it. It's where the strongest players in the world basically compete for a chance to defeat the reigning world champion Magnus Carlsen. And here, this was an exciting matchup between the former challenger Ian Nepomniachtchi and Ding Liren, who we're all very excited to see at the Candidates because he just barely qualified by playing enough games and maintaining his rating. So I'm just gonna jump straight into the game and just cover everything from the tactics, the ideas. So Ding started off with one c4, and Nepo went one e5 and g3. And here, Nepo actually had this position against Ding in multiple games. He had some from 2019, a couple from 2020. And Nepo has tried here knight c6 and knight f6, and the games were often like very back and forth where Ding won a couple, Nepo won a couple. And I think Nepo's next move really shows how he was trying to avoid Ding's prep in this opening. So he played the move c6, which has a very direct intention of just going d5 and occupying the center like that. And White has a lot of ways to respond to this. There was a recent game from White on Zay where Mamadzarov played Brogdonanda, which went d4, e4, and then Mamadzarov pulled out this interesting idea with queen a4. And the game got very complicated, but Mamadzarov won a very interesting game. So Nepo chose this opening to avoid Ding's prep, and actually I think that he had a lot of the ideas in mind already. So he came very well prepared to fight Ding in the English. And here we get this position where it resembles an Alapin, only it's like a reverse Alapin where White has this extra move, Black from the Sicilian has this extra move g3 or g6, I guess, from Black's perspective. For those who don't know what I'm talking about, so the Alapin from the start, if we reverse the board, I just want to quickly reverse the board so you guys can see what I'm talking about. If we look at it over here, in this opening, it's the same exact idea where White gets his center, but Black's goal is to basically try to break it down. Now imagine if Black got an extra move g6 in. That's what this opening is from this point of view. So basically, White has this almost like an extra move g3 to put the bishop on g2. Now, Nepo played queen takes. Now, c takes is also very possible. After c takes, you could just completely go into like Alapin style, where you try to play d3 and try to take down Black's center, which is a decent way to play. It's totally playable. Instead, he opted for more ambitious queen takes and knight c2. The knight on c2 looks a little bit odd. Now, I want to explain why knight b3 is a little bit. It's not really played that much, because the knight only has two real possibilities. He can eventually go to c5 whenever it's defended, or d4 whenever it's defended. And the knight doesn't really have any sort of potential on b3. And the game can go like this. This has been played before, where Black basically starts an initiative on the king side, and he also plays on the queen side, where this idea with a5, a4 comes, and the knight will be forced to move. It's not really ideal for White. This is not what White wants. So he plays knight c2, and the idea is to cover the b4 square for the moment, but more importantly, the knight will come to e3, where it will actually influence the center, and it'll cover the vital g4 square here. So knight f6, normal development from Nepo. Knight c3, hitting the queen. And notice how Nepo doesn't bring the queen all the way back to d8. Instead, he puts it on e5, where it has a bearing on the position. It's able to influence more of the central squares. He doesn't have to retreat it because the queen is actually placed in a good way. It's also defending the e-pawn, which becomes a vital aspect of the game. This e-pawn is actually quite weak, because it would need support from the f-pawn to keep it together, but even then Black might overextend. So Black's game here is to really try to hold on to this e-pawn and generate some sort of initiative on the king side here. where White is still, or where he hasn't castled yet, and where he might be able to get some sort of play going. So bishop g2, and here Nepo played knight a6, which is an excellent move. Now, a lot of players might think, okay, well, why didn't he just play this way? Right, knight on the rim is dim. Well, the knight on d7 is actually not well placed, because at some point this bishop wants to come to f5 or g4, and if the knight's on d7, it's blocking it. That's one reason. The second reason is this knight is actually going to have an annoying time. Not only does it block the piece, but if it can't really come to c5, because at some point white's going to play a3, b4, and just kick the knight away. So that's why Nepo played here knight a6. He's trying to reroute the knight via c7 to d5 at some point. Or maybe even c5 if the chance is available, or if there's any reason to go there. So white just castles and plays bishop e7. And here there have been a couple games where, well, not here, but here, where instead of knight e3, white has opted to try d3. And the reason this is not, the reason I think Ding did not play this is because I think Ding realized that this pawn is actually a weakness, and this would allow an exchange, which would get rid of black's only real weak pawn. Although it does give white some control of the center with his queen and knights. So it's a trade-off, but I think Ding realized that he doesn't need to do that yet because the pawn is kind of weak. So he plays knight e3 instead. And here, there have been 4 games here before. One of them was played by Grishik and Giri in the previous candidates from 2020, where Grishik decided to play h5 with the idea to try some sort of advance on the king side. This didn't really work out, as Giri basically just shut him down completely, and there was no real kingside initiative that occurred. Pieces were exchanged, and it fizzled out into an endgame. That sort of went like this. I'm just going to quickly rush through the game. Pieces were exchanged, and basically this fizzled down to a draw. Instead, Nepo opted to play here castles instead of h5, which was played before. This is a new move. It looks pretty reasonable to me, actually. But I think the reason it wasn't tried before is because of this weak e-pawn. Again, this pawn is really weak. It's not supported by the f-pawn. It's not supported by any other pawns. It's pieces that defend it. And white is going to play against it. So white starts by playing a3. This is to prevent the bishop or the knight basically coming into b4, c5. At some point, white is going to develop, take some space, and play bishop b2. And that's a very decent way for white to develop. It doesn't really make sense to play b3. You know, when you're basically going to put the bishop on b2 anyways, you might as well take more space. So a3, rook e8, and this is a way to x-ray the e-pawn, so it adds another layer of defense to it. The bishop might drop back to f8, or it might drop back to f6, or drop forward to f6, I guess. And only if the knight moves, of course, which is what happens in the game. So white just continue with b4, and then knight g4. And this does sort of, in a way, give the pawn to white. And I'm not really sure why Ding didn't take it. The commentators on Chess24 were saying how, okay, if this is just taken, then we reach a position like this. And honestly, I think that this is not too difficult for white. It doesn't seem like, I mean, to my eyes, it doesn't seem like black has enough on the king side to actually be compensation for the pawn. I think the idea is that if white were to ever play something like d4, then maybe the e3 pawn would become weak. Maybe this bishop would be a bad piece. Maybe white would have some trouble coordinating, and maybe this light squared bishop is actually a good piece. These are a lot of maybes, and I honestly don't know why Ding didn't just take this pawn. The other variation is actually even just to take this knight first if he didn't want to double this pawn structure and then take the pawn. And, you know, play f3 here, rook f2, and again, like it's actually not obvious. I mean, after e3, how does black move forward? Like, okay, you can put your knight here, but I guess I just develop. You know, at some point, I'm going to maybe kick your queen. My rook is fine, and yes, my kingside does look a little bit strange, but it doesn't seem like black has enough play to actually damage white in any sort of regard. So I don't actually know why this pawn wasn't taken. Instead, Ding just said, okay, well, whatever, I can take that pawn later. I mean, he's not exactly wrong. This pawn is very weak. And Nepo took the chance to just play queen h5 to threaten mate. You can't play h3 here as a note because after taking, this pawn just drops. So he can't really do that. So he had to play h4 here, which does create a hook for black. At some point, maybe g5 would become a possibility. So bishop f6, good move, basically just defending the pawn, but also pinning the knight to this bishop. Queen c2 guards the bishop. And so in this case, white doesn't really want to do this, because if these bishops are exchanged, this knight is actually a bit misplaced, where it would rather be on c3 to just pressure this pawn a bit. Instead, it's on b2, and it has to reroute sort of like this to get back into the game. It's just not a good position for the knight. So I think that's why he didn't exchange immediately. Instead, he played queen c2. Nepo just took. And obviously d takes, for people that don't know, if f takes, yes, you get the semi-open file, but you have a really bad weakness on g3, and the king side is looking kind of drafty. So I don't think that's what white wants to do. The other thing is, I think this also actually defends the e-pawn. I think black had a possibility of taking on c3 and then taking on e2. So d takes was more or less forced. So bishop f5, and now knight a4. Now, if this were to be taken, very interesting tactic. You can just take this, and after takes, and the piece is gone. You can't really insert this check. The piece is still gone. So that's why this e-pawn is not free anymore. So that's why white decided, okay, let's just exchange dark squared bishops. Maybe I have a different idea. And since his pawn is defended, maybe he has this idea of going knight c4, knight d6. Which is what happens in the game. He goes knight c4, and the threat is very clear. Knight d6, attacking the bishop, the rook, and the b7 pawn. So Nepo here plays a great move. Rook e6, very logical. The idea is to cover the d6 square, but to also prepare yourself to come to f6, g6, or even h6 at some point to pressure the white king side. Now, Ding just simply continued. He conquered the d file. And he's again reinstating the threat of knight d6. Nepo just completely shut that down with knight d5. Rook d4 was played. This is again to pressure the e-pawn, but I also think he was intending to double here. And here Nepo played h6. He had a much stronger move. He had g5, which is a very powerful move here. Because after h takes, queen takes, if white just continues with rook d1, for example, black can basically just play queen h5, and suddenly the h file looks very weak, and it's not clear how white's going to defend from that threat. It's a very scary position to play. The bishop might come to exchange itself, and the queen might invade with the rook, and this knight's a pretty good blockader. I think white might actually have to even just sack the exchange and basically hope for the best. But it's not over yet, because I mean he could just maybe conquer this long diagonal here. It's a complicated game, but he definitely had g5 here. Instead, he played h6, which makes sense. He's just preparing g5 and queen d2. I truthfully don't understand queen d2. I understand maybe he's trying to step away from the side of the bishop, but I mean rook d1 to my eyes seemed more legitimate. And if black were to just continue with rook ae8, then this could be taken, and this is not very obvious. I mean, there's a pin here, and this rook is activated. This knight might actually come to d6 at some point. It's not very clear to me. I think this is what maybe should have been done to prevent black from just completely conquering the king side. Instead, he played queen d2, which looks, to my eyes, a little bit strange. And then Nepo just followed up with rook ae8, very logical. King h2. Again, Nepo here had this resource g5 instead of rook ae8, but I think he was just trying to coordinate his pieces a little bit better before doing anything on the king side. There's a lot of patience involved here. And Ding came up with this interesting idea, king h2, just directly stepping into g5, and basically telling black like, okay, I don't really care if I'm pinned. And the idea here is actually really interesting. So if black does play g5 here, white can play rook h1, which is really cool. So if this is taken, king g1, and suddenly this pin becomes really annoying. And if black tries to go for h3, then rook h2. And it's actually not obvious how black is going to invade, because this pawn, it's basically pinned. If the queen ever moves, this pawn might be taken. The knight would have to probably reroute to kick the rook. It's not clear how black would break through here. So anyways, back to this position, this is the idea of king h2. It's a way to deter g5. And Nepo just had none of that, and he just played bishop g4 here, basically avoiding this entire idea, telling white, like, okay, I have your e-pawn under attack, and g5 is still in the cards. This rook might come into the game like this. It's a very difficult position to defend for white. So knight a5, with the idea to take on b7 and generate some counterplay. Now, an interesting little tidbit here, if black were to take this pawn, this is not ideal because actually he gets rid of most of his attacking chances. White can just take on b7, and after, let's say, rook f6, king g1, and it's not really clear how black is going to break through here. This is a computer line, of course, so bishop f3 takes, queen takes, and the other thing is that black has basically this permanent weakness on e4 that he has to deal with. So in all these cases, like rook a2 is a great move by the computer to just defend f2 and the second rank, and without this light squared bishop or any sort of pawn breaks, it's not clear how black is breaking through. If black tries the same plan of g5, there's an amazing move h5. I mean, this is all computer stuff, where white gives up this pawn, but in return, he's going to try to pick up this pawn. And this knight made a very weird journey from b2 to c4 to a5 to b7 to c5. And finally, it landed on this amazing square where you can't touch this knight, and the e-pawn is very weak, and there's no clear way to actually break through white's king. I mean, black would need to take some time to push these kingside pawns. Like, the game can go on like this, and white actually just completely overwhelms the e-pawn, and it's going to fall at some point. So that's what would have happened if bishop takes e2 was played. Although I think probably someone like Nepo would have seen that bishop takes e2 is not working. So instead he played rook f6, which just immediately asks white, like, okay, what are you doing with this f-pawn? I don't think you want to push it, because then you're going to drop it. So then defending it with the queen is very awkward. This is not something that black even, like, I mean, g5 is just very strong. This is going to get shredded apart, and it's not very clear like what white is going to do here. So he has to play king g1 here, but now the whole idea with rook h1 followed by king g1 is completely null and void. There's just no point of even playing king h2 at this point, because rook f6 nullifies it. g5, very direct, just trying to destroy white's king side. Knight takes b7. Now here Ding had a very interesting idea, which was b5. It's kind of incredible. Your king is getting your king is under attack, and you're playing queenside moves. It's just a very strange thing to see. And I think Ding here was under some severe time pressure, which is part of the reason why he didn't see this. Or maybe he just overestimated just how strong black's attack is. I mean, black does have a very strong attack, but white does have counterplay chances. And if black proceeds with, like, let's say g takes h4, suddenly we see how this knight loses its protection for the moment. So h takes g3, basically threatening mate in like 1,000 different ways. So this must be taken. And now queen e5. And in this position, white survives by playing queen e1 and some of these good defensive moves where the e3 pawn is defended. and there's still this pawn on c6. So this is a computer variation, of course. It's not easy to see why this works. And if something like h3, then this is taken. Like there's basically there's just no way to actually for black to actually continue here. I think the computer says it's lost or something. This can be taken, but then the queen is lost, and there's nothing that black can do. But knight takes b7 was played instead of b5. Knight takes b7 was played, which makes sense. It's a pawn, why not? And in a way, it does seem like the knight will reroute and attack e4. So g takes, and now the knight reroutes, and here h3 was played. Now, interesting thing here: if bishop h1, h2, king f1, and the king is just going to get completely chased to the other side of the board, and this move queen g1 will kill him because it's attacking the rook, attacking the bishop, and white has no way to defend this. So there was really nothing that could be done here. After h3, Ding opted to just give up his bishop, and after takes, basically there's some serious threats. If king takes here, very cool tactic, rook f2, and now queen h2, and this just leads to mate, and that's mate. So that's the trick, that white can't take on g2 immediately, so Ding had to play f4. Queen h1, king f2, Nepo just picks up the rook in the corner, and after this, the final move of the game, bishop h3. What a move. This is really just excellent calculation from Nepo. Basically, if white were to take this bishop, this leads to mate. White's king is just dragged across the board, and queen h3 threatens like queen f5. I mean, it's just impossible to save this position. Yeah, I mean, queen g4 is threatened, queen f5 is threatened. Like there's a mate threat in like 100 different ways. So yeah, so that was a great first round game by Nepo. Ding just, I think Ding's issue here was that he basically, I think in a way he underestimated. First of all, he didn't take the pawn when it was just hanging. It was a bit strange to play bishop b2 and just not take the pawn. Maybe he saw some sort of tactic, but I mean, he had multiple chances to even take the pawn as well, and instead he opted to do this exchange of bishops, which maybe wasn't the most ideal because this knight, as we saw, became very useless. It landed on c4, and it just didn't actually have a serious purpose in the game. Maybe it was better if it was on c3, but who knows? Hindsight is 20/20. The other issue is I think Ding, in a way, underestimated black's attacking chances here. I think he focused a lot on this e-pawn here, and I don't think he realized just how strong this attack on white's king is going to be. But again, hindsight is 20/20. So that's it for this game. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed it. Bye.